My name is Matilde Vaghi. I studied psychology to then decide to get biological understanding of how our emotions or our cognitive processes work. I'm technically defined as a cognitive neuroscientist, and this means that I study the brain and try to understand which part of the brain are important for processing our emotions or directing our attention to some stimuli. And the overall aim is to understand how these things works in our normal life, and then also to understand how these things can go wrong in patients with psychiatric disorders.
I was reading your text before we started the discussion, and I think there were a couple of interesting points. Of course, you have more like a psychological view of the project, but also you talked a lot about feeling of loneliness. Also the effect of lockdown or like social isolation, let's say, and how this has influenced us because you're alone, but at the same time you're always connected because you are using, of course, technology. So I would like actually to elaborate a bit on how do you think the lockdown is influencing people and how this is playing a role also with our feeling of loneliness.
Yeah, so it's of course quite complicated and a complex issue. And I guess that the most important thing to reflect upon is that in general, whatever events happen to us, there is a great variability and individual differences in terms of how we react to certain type of events. My reflection was based on the idea that we know for sure that being lonely or being alone might a negative impact on our feelings. So we might feel more sad, we might feel like less motivated in doing things, but other people might have perceived this challenge induced by the social isolation as a kind of motive to react in a proactive way and try to find the best out of a situation. So what is really interesting from a psychological perspective perhaps is that each of us is different and the same event can be perceived in different ways. And similarly, I feel like the other aspect is the fact that technology specifically in this way allowed us perhaps to feel more connected than we would have been without technology, for example. And this also maybe played a role in the way we react to this situation. You can also think about people that perhaps have anxiety in terms of when they interact with people. So perhaps there are people that are very shy and they feel challenged by our normal everyday life when they have constant social interactions. So for these people, perhaps isolation or the lockdown offered an opportunity to calm down and relax.
So basically like the social aspect of life has been cut out. So some people that they feel a lot of social pressure, maybe they would actually feel better during the lockdown.
Yeah.
People adapt to these new circumstances and how to find out a new mechanism to live their life in a new way. Could you a little bit elaborate on this, also in relation, of course, to this coping strategy that you mentioned in your text?
Yeah. What I study, for example, is cognitive flexibility, which is a construct whereby you have to adapt to the situation. So if you keep the same strategy, no matter what's your environment, then that strategy is going to be a failure because basically you're not flexible enough to understand which are the demands of the environment to adapt your way of behaving. And in this way, being flexible, so being able to adapt to a new situation, proved to be a successful way to deal with the situation, so to adapt quickly to sudden and very dramatic changes to our life. So a coping strategy is in general whatever type of strategy that allow you to cope with the situation. For example, we can think about exercise to cope with stress, or in some maladaptive circumstances, for example, to have a glass of wine to calm down the anxiety. So these are two different types of coping strategies. One is positive and the other one is negative, and we can think of people adopting these strategies in different ways in different contexts.
You basically mentioned our project Oggetti Socievoli as also a way of coping with what was happening.
I guess that it was for me a nice stimulation to think about this concept of flexibility, so how we can reinvent objects in a new light given that the situation has changed. So something that in one particular situation, an object serve a given purpose needed to be reinvented and reinterpreted in this new framework, in this new situation. To me, it was an interesting way to think about how cognitive flexibility again allows us to see objects in different light depending on the different context.
So yeah, our intention it was actually to have a stimulus for people to look at things from a different point of view, also become a little bit more aware of what was happening, what did they use around them in a different way, and be also more positive in relation to the situation.
As I said, maybe in my text, this project offered a way to connect virtually. It was a chance, like via Instagram, to see how everyone was challenged by the situation the same way, and a way to feel more connected. So again, we were alone in our house, but we were able, through a strategy of feeling more connected, if you know what I mean.